We had as a theme for the conference fraud detection. And several of the panels are focused on detecting fraud. And the next one is on the use of forensic analytics to detect fraud. I think there are, in my mind, two of the leading academics who work in this space. There are two of them. One is John Griffin, who can't be here but runs Integra. I mentioned Integra earlier. We'll have him next year, and the second is Dan. So Dan, it's all yours. We'll do a half hour on using forensic analytics to detect fraud.
All right. Mic'd up? All right. All right, so big thanks to the conference organizers for having us, and thanks to Chris and Hayne for agreeing to be on the panel. Hayne is subbing in for Melissa, who got COVID and has to be in quarantine. Hayne is the director of the SEC's Retail Task Force, and Chris is the CEO of Bedrock AI. So it's like, okay, it's got the word AI in the thing. That's cool. What does it do? And so her company basically has trained natural language models to scan SEC filings in real time and then highlight red flags. So the way that we thought about how we would run this panel is that I get to interview the panelists about their thoughts on fraud detection and analytics fraud detection within the private sector and within the SEC. And then we may or may not have time for questions at the end. But so this panel is really going to be focused on using data. So it's not going to be really about individual names. It's going to be about how can we, big picture, use data to detect fraud and detect bad behavior. So with that, I'm going to start with you, Chris, if you don't mind.
Awesome.
Could you talk a little bit about what Bedrock AI is and how you started and how you created it and why?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been told that no one here believes that machine learning is real, so I'll try to be persuasive. So Bedrock, as you said, is software that extracts red flags from securities filings and predicts fraud, hence why I'm here. We process Ks, Qs, the whole shebang in real time and serve that to customers through a web application. We use language models on the back end, which are really cool, but to learn qualitative indicators, so textual indicators that have an association with high impact downside risk. It's like having a very fast, very prolific forensic analyst in your pocket with a slightly higher false positive rate.
So can you talk a little bit about your journey to Bedrock? Because you have an accounting background originally, and now you're doing more data science-y type stuff. So what was the impetus or the motivation for going down the entrepreneurial route?
Right. So our mission is corporate accountability through information transparency. And I used to work at KPMG as an auditor in mining, so no interest in fraud whatsoever. And then transitioned into data science and sort of ended up in this role where I was doing computational text processing and just sort of discovered that there weren't a lot of people out there doing that much in the space, both in industry and to some extent in academia as well, and just saw it as an opportunity. I mean, there's very few people who are still reading a 10K in detail, and stuff gets missed. Details don't get priced in, or maybe not understood, and that's one of the reasons that bad actors get funded for as long as they do. And I believe software is part of the solution.
So you mentioned there are not that many, relatively speaking, not that many people doing natural language processing of these forms. Surely there are people doing like this traditional quantitative analysis on like balance sheets and cash flow statements and income statements. Can you talk a little bit about strengths and weaknesses of focusing on the language in the form as opposed to like calculating a leverage ratio and then predicting fraud as a function of like leverage or sales growth?
Yeah, I think a lot of people here who invest would agree with me that once you start seeing the fraud come through in the numbers and the ratios, it's generally pretty late in the cycle. And if you're trying to do that algorithmically, if you're trying to predict fraud algorithmically, based purely on numeric data or financial ratios, looking at days sales outstanding, whatever that is, you're just going to end up with a pretty high false positive rate. And generally, if you are doing this type of research as a human being, you're looking for what? Related party transactions, you're looking at the relationships between suppliers, you're looking at management being overly aggressive, and all of these sort of more qualitative, lots of changes to presentation in the financial statements, lots of changes in accounting policy. All of those things are qualitative. All of those things require you to read, which is why we're focused on the computational reading aspect.
Okay, so could you talk about, so on that, could you talk a little bit about the use case for the software, for the system? Is it just DD or due diligence by private parties? Can it help regulators? Like what do you see as the set of use cases?
Yeah, so I mean, we do have a fair number of customers in the audience, including I think people who are in our beta testing. So please feel free to turn to your partner and ask. So obviously one application is short idea generation. We do screening, red flag detection. We have risk scores, and our top 300 companies in the Russell 3000 had average returns of negative 22% over a year-long period. But we also, of course, do due diligence. It on the long side, it feels a lot better to see a really shitty note that breaks your thesis 15 minutes into the research rather than 10 hours into reading securities filings. We're really focused on bringing all of that information that's hidden instead of making people search for things. A lot of these events are very, very rare. Having language models find them and bring them to your attention before you've thought to search for warehouse fire resulting in covenant offside, whatever.
Okay. Do you feel comfortable talking about maybe some regulatory things that you've been working on, or?
Absolutely. So there's been, I think it's been popular to be a bit negative about the regulatory framework and how much is getting detected out there. But one thing I would say there's so much information out there, and from a regulatory perspective, just as much from any capital market actor, there's an overwhelming amount of information, and so much of it is qualitative, and there are very, very few software tools out there to actually help you review and find this information. So we're really excited about our RegTech side of the business. We've worked with the Global Financial Innovation Network. I think the SEC is part of that. The Australian Securities and Investment Commission on working on just programmatically identifying problematic disclosure. A lot of that isn't about identifying fraud. It's about helping the corporate finance workflow. We've done some really cool projects about looking at where indicators of impairment exist, but maybe appropriate write-downs or appropriate disclosure doesn't exist, looking at pump and dump campaigns, so disclosure of LOIs or partnerships that aren't actually substantive in nature, and then some of the more technical parts of the corporate finance workflow.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Okay, so that'll transition us to regulatory tools and how the regulators think about using tools like Chris's or others to detect fraud or bad behavior. So do you want to give your disclaimer, Han, or do you want to start in with the questions?
So the views I express today are my own, do not necessarily reflect those of the staff, the commissioners, or the SEC. Yep.
Okay, all right, so now we're going to start hitting you with hard questions. All right, so how does the SEC think about lead generation in terms of building enforcement cases, because you are with the enforcement division, obviously, and what role does analytics play in that?
Yeah, so lead generation obviously is very important to enforcement. We go about it in a number of ways. Data analytics is part of it, but certainly there are a plethora of different avenues as well. Important to us is of course, and especially in the New York regional office where I sit, are our partnerships with the other divisions, in particular Division of Examinations. So a lot of our cases come through that way, and exams has a number of data analytical tools that they use. And then, of course, we're opening up cases a lot of the time just based on sort of traditional methods, so tips from members of the public, referrals or tips from self-regulatory organizations like FINRA, New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, industry participants, tips from sister agencies, even news media, of course. And I want to flag in particular like the whistleblower program, which is not a specifically data program, but it's an incredibly important tool for us in our cases. Since 2011, we've received over 26,000 tips through the program. And of course, not all the tips lead to enforcement actions, but the program as a whole is really successful, and I think that's most clearly evidenced by the contribution to the protection of investors. So cases that are brought from whistleblower tips have resulted in financial remedies of nearly $5 billion, and then of that, we've awarded $1 billion to over 250 whistleblowers since the program began. I have all my stats here, that's on my notes. And of that, over $500 million was awarded in fiscal year 2021 alone, 2 awards over $100 million. So this is obviously an incredibly important aspect to our bringing our cases enforcement. And they are bringing cases on corporate disclosure financials, offering fraud, manipulation, looking through those sort of disclosure documents that Chris's team might be able to look through with AI, but having someone there pointing to it and talking about it is always incredibly useful for us. And we want to build our cases, we always need a witness, generally.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about, build on that. So then is it fair to say maybe that the role of analytics in the enforcement workflow isn't necessarily in lead generation, because you need that witness, you need the smoking gun, you need the emails, the phone conversations, the pieces of paper, which analytics can't give you. And they're really the analytic tools come in once you have the lead and you're then doing a follow-up investigation to see whether there's actually something there.
Yeah, it's definitely both, though. We do use analytics for lead generation. We have a number of initiatives. I'm the chief of the Retail Strategy Task Force, and part of our mandate is, developing proactive, targeted initiatives to identify misconduct that affects retail investors. We're leveraging data analytics, experience within the commission. That said, all of those are not public at the moment.
Okay.
I have a couple that are public, though, that have led to actual cases. The division's earnings per share initiative, so that was the EPS initiative, that used risk-based analytics to uncover potential accounting disclosure violations caused by earnings, management practices that masked or trying to mask unexpectedly weak performances, and a number of cases were brought out of that. We also had the division's exchange traded products initiative that was brought out of the complex financial instruments unit. We helped with that, and our STF helped with that somewhat. And that uses trading data and analytics to discover potentially unsuitable sales, particular to retail folks. And that is something that we worked on, enforcement worked on with different analytical groups within the commission. And so those are all initiatives. There's also, we have a case that was able to uncover improper perquisites. And then also, a recent one discovered difficult to detect disclosure violations relating to Form NT filings. And so this might a little bit touch on sort of what Chris does. But there were situations where people were filing Form NTs improperly, not disclosing the reasons why, the true reasons why they wanted to do that, we allege, and we brought a number of cases as a result of that. So those were all like proactive initiatives. And then certainly we use analytics, of course, in the course of our investigations, trading, looking for insider trading, market manipulation, et cetera.
Yeah, so one thing I want to highlight on that, the EPS initiative is near and dear to my heart, because those of you, it's very rare that people consume academic accounting research. But those of you that do consume it, may know that there's a well-known discontinuity at 1 cent per share. And that's been known since the 80s. Former SEC Commissioner Joe Grunfest published a paper recently extending that to round numbers. So there seems to be a lot of 5 cents a share and very, very few 4 cents a share. And so at least the public understanding of the EPS initiative is that academic research might have inspired that initiative. Near and dear to my heart, you mentioned at the end, is sort of the insider trading and the markets tools that you're using. Could you talk a little bit, since those programs are public, Do you feel comfortable talking a little bit about those tools?
Yeah, so I can talk at a high level. So there are a couple tools that we use pretty regularly. One is called Atlas, which is the Abnormal Trading and Link Analysis System, which I learned preparing for this talking panel. So that one was an exam and enforcement-driven initiative to facilitate identification of various U.S. securities laws violations. Atlas really allows us to easily harness multiple streams of data, blue sheets, pricing, public announcements. The use cases can include evaluating activity of a particular equity event for possible insider trading, looking at historical pricing, maybe in litigation. You can assess an entire blotter as well for sort of serial insider trading. And through Atlas, you can identify suspicious patterns, relationships, connections that involve securities transactions. Another tool that we use in enforcement is called Artemis. And again, that's Advanced Relational Trading Enforcement Metric Investigation System, which I'd be surprised if very many people know that in the SEC, but that's a name. And that was developed by the market abuse team. So this is looking for abusive trading practices, like certainly insider trading type activity, using the electronic database of over many billions of electronic, equities, options trading. So this, again, it can be used proactively to develop lead generation or in the midst of an investigation. And then I also want to flag a tool called NEAT that is used by our Division of Examinations, but also we'll sometimes I'll use that as well in enforcement just to help our cases. And that's called the National Exam Analytics Tool. This allows examiners to collect, analyze large data sets of trading records to identify potentially problematic activity, better understand a firm's business during exams. Through NEAT, staff can analyze trading records of registrants like IA, investment advisors, or other broker-dealers, as well as look for sort of anti-money laundering issues.
So is it fair to say that you think the SEC is on the ball? Because what you just rattled off like a list of algorithms and Greek gods and whatnot. Do you think that they're...
We are good at acronyms, so that is certainly the truth. No. I think that we care deeply about data. We think about it. We're trying to come up with different ways to master it, analyze it. AI stuff is very interesting as well. Machine learning is always interesting as well. And so I think that's a huge focus. And obviously there is a ton of data. And we're working on, using it in any way that is helpful for us in enforcement.
Gotcha. Excellent. Cool.
So I'd love to turn the tables here. Dan, do you have a perspective on the regulatory, public versus private, what role each has to play?
Yeah, I mean,
hearing us?
It's interesting, I would say, because I think, early in my academic career, I was, not really, to be honest with you, not really paying attention to markets. And there's a school of thought within academics that everything happens instantaneously and transactions costs are minimal. And so it was surprising to me, maybe obvious now, that that's a very far characterization of how the world works. And so I've been somewhat surprised relative to where my mindset was when I began this journey, at how, in some sense, reliant the market and our regulators are on the private market for enforcement. So I think oftentimes we think a lot about the public market for enforcement, being the SEC, DOJ, CFTC, et cetera. And I've been surprised over my journey I actually think at the primary, if you were to rank order, I think that the primary market of importance for detection is the private sector. So that's one reason why I like this conference, is it gets people together who are all interested in detecting fraud, and it's a meeting of the minds of the private sector and of the public sector. But I do think that the private sector is by far and away, they don't have the regulatory constraints or the resource constraints that our regulators have. They don't serve political masters. So if there's a buck to be made at predicting fraud, I have faith that the private sector will do that.
Right.
So.
And how about academia? What do you think the role is?
Yeah, I mean, I've been pleasantly surprised, to be honest with you. I think in the beginning I was pretty skeptical of what role I could play as an academic or academics in general, because I'm not going to be putting out activist reports. I'm not going to be, taking on $1 million short positions. I certainly can't bring anybody to court. And so it's interesting to think about what role academics can play. And part of that, I think, is big picture. So what's the failing of the private sector market? Well, what's the failing of the private sector market that focuses on individual names, whether it be Enron or a given name from an activist? That helps with individual fraud detection. But at some level, you have to abstract away from this, and this was the theme of some of the earlier talks, and ask, what is wrong with the existing system that enables those abuses to continue? And I think as an academic, I don't have to worry about selling stuff to investors or to customers. And so that affords us this opportunity to scroll back and think big picture about things that may not be, monetizable by a private market. So you would say like a private market failure. We've got two great case studies on this. Some of you might be aware of my work on 10b5-1, these pre-planned insider trades that are, were all the rage with Pfizer and Moderna again. And, the Wall Street Journal, Tom and Mark just wrote a great expose on 10b5-1 trades using, data that we helped them get. And so the SEC, has proposed rules to clean up 10b5-1 and to effectively end the practices that we documented as being problematic. And they did that in a relatively short time. So I've been surprised at how speedy the rulemaking side of the SEC has been as opposed to enforcement. So an enforcement investigation may take 6 or 7 years to see it all the way through. But in rulemaking, they can get rules out relatively fast, especially this SEC. So another example is we wrote a paper with Rob Jackson, who will be here in a little bit later. And we found that the SEC was still accepting paper filings, right? So some of you might not have seen the Wall Street Journal piece, but if you're a foreign company that's listed in the US, so like an Alibaba or a Didi or an AstraZeneca, you're exempt from Section 16 of the Exchange Act. And what that means is that your corporate insiders do not have to file their trades publicly on EDGAR. So you call me out on this, go to EDGAR, look up the Form 4 insider trade for Didi or Alibaba, you won't find them. So, okay, so great, they don't have to file them. So what's the controversy? Well, the controversy is there's another form that I'd never heard about before called Form 144. Some of you who are active market participants may have heard of that form. It's filed on paper in the SEC reading room, right, which isn't literally the basement of the SEC, but you do have to go down steps from the first floor to get to it. And you can check me out on Twitter, check me out at Wharton. We've got great photos like Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you go into the reading room and there are all these file cabinets, and the paper Form 144s are in the file cabinets. So with some help of the Washington service, who had been sending someone to digitize those forms, so they must be valuable because the private sector is sending somebody to scan them, we actually looked at the trading of executives in Chinese-listed companies, Russian-listed companies, companies from India, from Netherlands, who are listed in the US but aren't publicly disclosing their trades. And the average loss avoidance was staggering. In total, it was about 10 billion over the past 3 years, with average returns after a trade of minus 25%. And brought that to some attention. Fortunate, they proposed the rule, they finalized the rule. In 6 months, Form 144 will no longer be on paper. It'll be filed electronically, it'll be on EDGAR. And we have a act, or I guess a bill that was introduced in the Senate. It is bipartisan by Senators Van Hollen and Kennedy. You might recognize those names. They were the original sponsors of the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. And it is now going to be named the Holding Foreign Insiders Accountable Act, to basically require them to file Form 4 and to roll back the exemption to Section 16. And I'm not sure that the private sector could have tackled those problems because it's not clear how you could have monetized it. So that's what I think the role is for academics, is taking a big picture perspective and then putting it in the press, creating some pressure for the commission to actually close the gaps that sort of enable enable the abuses. So it was a long-winded answer, but I think, I think our role is far more important than most people appreciate.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. Hats off.
Thank you.
Yeah, really incredible. So on the other side, I'd love to hear the critical angle. I obviously have some opinions about some maybe gaps in academic research, but I'd love to hear your perspective about, what are the challenges or issues in academic work?
So I think there's the producer side of the research and the consumer side of the research, right? Most people here are interested in the consumer side, so I'll just talk lightly about the producer side. The producer side is really tough. Really the only person that I know that has cracked the producer side to a much better extent than I have is John Griffin, that Frank mentioned at Texas Austin. But it's really challenging because academics want theory testing, and they want to test the CAPM, test market efficiency. And as most of the participants in this audience know, neither one of those things actually holds water. So it's actually really challenging to get fraud prediction and insider prediction papers published. And I'm kind of surprised at how difficult it is given the impact that we're actually having on the world. So that's the producer side, that's my problem. The consumer side, I was not as concerned about because it was like, well, I'm the producer, and I don't have to sell my product. It just, gets produced. But now I'm increasingly concerned about the consumer side because I don't think people quite appreciate the biases that go into the production. So there's something called publication bias. So if there's an academic paper that says fraud, or we have a fraud prediction model that works, well, you wouldn't be reading it if it didn't work. So there are incentives in place within academia to produce papers that may be sensational for the purposes of advancing one's career or getting tenure, because that's the surest way to get the paper published. If you had a paper and said, look, I find that fraud is not predictable, not going to get published. And so that means that a lot of the work is difficult to replicate, right? As I'm sure that you're aware, there hasn't really been an embrace of an in-sample and out-of-sample testing. There's not really been an embrace of sort of rigorous adjustments for taking things out of sample. So that's really, I would say, the consumer side. The other thing that I think is increasingly dangerous as AI and ML, those words just get thrown around as a buzzword. And so as a consequence, you might have somebody with a master's in data science, or they got a certificate in data science from Google. And maybe you hire them to work on some projects that you have for your fund. And you say, oh, well, wow, I'm using AI and machine learning, and this person knows something about it. The problem now is that those words have become consulting. And when the word enters the consulting lexicon, it devalues what it means. And so there are programs where you can just dump in the variables and click run machine learning, right? Like that's not actually doing the kind of stuff that actual data scientists, what Chris is doing, what I'm doing in academic labs. So I do think there's been a little bit of a cheapening of the use of those terms in the private sector. And then the final one is, I think it's difficult for the public in general and for the participants to be able to distinguish among our journals. So in academia, we have this really rigid journal system where there's like A-level journals, B-level journals, C-level journals. And to get into an A-level journal, you have to produce an incredibly rigorous, almost too rigorous, like dot all your I's, cross all your T's. If there's anything wrong, if there's any lack of statistical analysis, it's out. So I think that's bad. But I think what's worse is that there's not an appreciation within the practitioner community, and it's not reasonable to expect them to be able to differentiate, for that hierarchy. So oftentimes you'll see in the media papers that are published in journals that academics know publish anything, but they get the headline, and maybe they generate some negative publicity. And so it's like, well, how do I know that that's a bad paper? How do I know that it's a good paper? It's got a name on it and it's published. Not all published papers are created equal. You should ask, is the person that produced this paper trained in data analysis? Is the person discussing this paper trained in data analysis? Because it's really, really hard. We go through 5 years in a PhD program. Not, sorry to say, that's not 3 years in a JD program where they don't teach data. All right? So just like, you wouldn't look to me for legal advice If there are lawyers talking about interpreting data and their rigorous analysis, and they don't have background in data, you know, maybe they're, the end of it is basically if someone is in a three-piece suit and they're talking to you about, you know, data analysis and interpretation and whatnot, you know, maybe you should, you know, give them a little look out of the hint of your eye, just like you might if I was offering you legal advice. So we've got a couple seconds left. Frank, are we allowed for questions or none? All right, very good. All right, thank you guys for having us. Thank you to the panelists.